In this position, it's white to move. What would you play? Alright, the best move for white here is going to be h4. We want to support the g5 square for the knight because we know that d5 is coming. So if black plays d5, we go knight g5. Now we're hitting the rook, we're also hitting h7. So black can't really deal with both. Taking the knight on g5 is going to be a disaster after h takes g5. Now this square is hit by 2 pieces. There's not a good response. You can play e4, try to block out the bishop, but just bishop takes e4. This pawn here is pinned. And if you try g6, of course, we got bishop takes g6. So this pawn's pinned, so this isn't really working. You could try moving the rook somewhere, but then we just got bishop takes h7. White is winning here. If you try moving the rook first, we got knight g5. Then if you do this, g6, we got bishop e4. This knight is pinned, so you have to defend that somehow, and then we can just take on d6. White is winning here. If you play g6 first, there's the idea of taking the knight and then winning this pawn with the queen like so. But again, bishop e4 hits this knight, and after black defends, we can again take on d6. Now you might think rook d8 is good for black, but here, queen takes g6 actually works. This pawn's pinned. So queen takes, bishop takes. You know, taking on d1 doesn't help because we'll take with the knight to maintain this pin. Now let's see what happens if h4 isn't played. If you play something like maybe bishop e2, you want to discourage that move there. Well, then we got knight d4. If you try to kick the knight, then black gets some counterplay with d5. If you try to play h4 here, we got d5, knight g5, but then rook takes f2. This is a little different. We're not hitting the square. We've lost a pawn. If you play something passive, let's say you play this move here, well then d5, and the knight is going to end up having to go to g3 or f2, and this is not nearly as strong for white. Here it's black to move. What would you play? Here black can win a pawn with f takes g4, h takes g4, and then bishop takes e5. If the bishop is captured, well, we get the rook. Black to move, what would you play? Okay, black can win a pawn with bishop takes h2 check, and if the king captures, we got rook takes on a7, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen to b8 check, king moves, queen takes a7. Now it's important to realize that rook taking on a7 first doesn't work because rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and if you go bishop takes h2 check here, the king can simply move, and now we've lost the exchange and we've gotten one pawn in return, but this is not as good as simply taking on h2 first. Black to move, what would you play? The best move for black here is going to be f5. This kind of nullifies white's threats of either playing f5 or e5 in some lines. It gives this black queen a square to potentially go to. Let's look at what happens if black had done something passive. Let's just say a5. We got rook g1 here. Queen goes to f6, then you got e5. If takes, and then the queen has to move, and we got rook g4 hitting this knight, also supporting this square here for the knight to come in, which is not good. So we want to play f5. You might think b4 is good, but here f5 is played in this line. It takes, and now in between move, knight to d5. Okay, so you don't have time to take this pawn or anything. The threat here is knight to e7 with the fork, so you got to do something about that. And then white can actually play this move. Queen takes h7, queen takes knight f6 check. White can get away with that kind of tactic. So it's best to play f5 and attack this pawn. If pawn takes, queen takes, white has these weak doubled pawns here. If e5 is played, then we can just put the rook behind it, and black is doing just fine. If this move is played, we got queen to f7, so f5 is best. In this position, it's white to move. What would you play? The best move for white here is bishop takes e7, and this should equalize after d5. The queen takes on c3, queen takes, pawn takes, rook takes e7, and white is a pawn up, but this pawn is very weak, so this is roughly equal. What you don't want to do is take on c3 and allow bishop takes g5, queen takes, and then d5. In this variation, white is still a pawn up, but the queens are still on the board. So this king is weak and in a much more precarious situation than if the queens had been exchanged. Now let's look at some alternatives after bishop takes e7 for black that don't really work, like knight takes d1. We're going to take on d6, in between move, protecting the bishop. The point is this knight can't be saved, so you got knight takes b2, and then we have d7 hitting the queen. Queen moves. Now we get a queen here on d8, rook takes, bishop takes. Now the knight can counterattack our queen like this. You know, black's queen is attacked, but then something like this, bishop takes, knight takes, king takes, and here this is good for white. White is winning, as you can see, extra pawn. This pawn's hit. So let's look at something else. Maybe rook takes e7 here. We're going to take on d6. If the knight takes, we take on the rook there. And again, the knight's trapped. Knight can go here. We're going to throw in this move, get our queen to draw the queen off of that c-file so we can take with our queen. And black doesn't have queen takes queen. White is winning in that variation. Let's look at rook d7. B takes c3, white's 2 pawns up here. Let's look at knight d5. We'll just take on d6. This is very good. Finally, knight d5. We'll just take on d6 like this, and we're 2 pawns up here. White to move here, what would you play? Okay, so black has a couple of threats. The most obvious, d5, we don't really want that move to get played. It's better to be able to take on d6, like so, but this runs into rook to c8. And here there's a mate threat on c2. So how does white deal with that? Queen d2 isn't working because queen to a1 will be mate. So let's say you defend with the rook, rook e2, but now there's this rook c5 move. And once the queen moves, you can even go to d8 with check. It's not helping because rook f8, now the queen has to move again. You have this queen a1 check, king d2, rook d5 check, and this rook on d1 will be lost. So that's kind of the problem with taking on d6. So queen to e3 is best because black has to deal with his queen being under attack. You can take on e5, but then takes, and white is actually better here. Black has this weak pawn. You can throw in the queen to a1 check. Doesn't really help. King d2, and the queen's again under attack. You can take the pawn there. It runs into a similar variation, or you can take on a2, but then we get our e takes d6, and white is fine here. Other moves don't really work. Rook to e3 runs into queen a1 check. King moves, queen d4 check, and at the end of the day, black is going to have some check, like here queen f2 check, and then he's going to be able to play d5. Same thing with like king e2, we got queen c4 check followed by d5. So queen to e3 is the best move here. White to move, what would you play? So you can see that this rook is tied down to defending the g-pawn, and that's not ideal for white. What we'd really like to do is defend it with the bishop. The best square would be bishop on f4, but how do we get the bishop there? Well, we can actually play bishop g3. The point is, if king takes g5, we got bishop e5, discovered check on the king, and the king must move to the h-file. Then we put the bishop on f4, so we've sacrificed the pawn, but we have this nice open file for the rook now, and this king is stranded over here on the h-file, and black can't advance the pawn so easily without the help of the king. So this is white's best method for trying to secure a draw. Now let's look at some alternatives. let's say we try to defend with the bishop on h4. Well, black's going to move the rook and try to maybe come in on this c-file here. So if you go rook c1, now you got king to h5 attacking the bishop. This g5 pawn is going to fall, and the king's going to be able to assist in advancing pawns. If you don't move your rook over to the c-file, I don't know, let's say rook g3 or something, now you got rook c8, the rook's coming in. White is totally lost here. So that is the best hope for white. Maybe white can get a draw with bishop to g3. Black to move, what would you play? You can see white has a strong attack going. So the best way for black to deal with this is knight takes d4. You need to get that knight out of there. Now queen f6 can't be played here, threatening mate, because you got knight to e6 guarding g7, and white's simply down a piece. So you got to take on d4. Then we want to attack the queen, bishop e7. Then once the queen moves, we got f5. And black is fine here. Now you might think that bishop e7 first is playable, but then you got this move rook to e1. And this bishop is pinned. If the bishop takes the queen, then, you know, rook takes rook. It's going to be mate. So let's say you play something like bishop d7, adding some protection to this rook. Then we got rook takes e7, and black is just totally busted here, because after rook takes, we got this queen to f6 move, and mate is unavoidable. So taking the knight on d4 is really best. If you do something else like bishop f8, you got this move f5, and this is looking kind of nasty here. So knight takes d4 is the most forcing. The knight must be recaptured, and then we can simply hit the queen and play f5. Even playing f5 here is maybe okay. Black to move, what would you play? Okay, white has the threat here of knight takes g7, so you really need to play king to h8. If you play something else, let's say rook a to c8, knight takes, bishop takes, then f6, the bishop's pinned. You can defend with the queen, but then takes on g7, queen takes, king takes, and then at the end you have rook takes f7 check, and this bishop is under attack also, so black is totally lost here. So king to h8 is the best way to nullify that threat. King to f8 doesn't really work here because of rook to f3, and this threat is going to be alive again if you make some move like this. You got knight takes g7, bishop takes, and then f6, bishop takes, and then you got this rook move here, and that bishop will be lost unless you move it. But then you got rook takes f7 check. This is not good because that rook is defended by the bishop. Black is finished. That doesn't really work after king h8, that whole idea of rook to f3, because here, if knight g7 were to be taken, you got this move rook g8, pinning the knight, which would not be available if the king was over here on f8. Black to move, what would you play? The winning move here is rook takes g2. Now if the rook on the f-file takes, we go bishop takes g2 check, rook takes, queen d1 check, next move will be mate. So let's try taking with the other rook. Rook g takes g2, queen d1 check, mate on the next move. You can try bishop takes g8, but rook takes f2 is a discovered check. So this is not working for white. Now look at the difference if you were to start with bishop takes g2 check. Now white's okay because you take with the rook, and if you take on g2 here, bishop takes g8 is just fine. There's no discovered check by moving this rook. So this is just a drawn position.